Shein, the Chinese fast fashion marketplace adored by Gen Z, hated by designers, shrouded in controversy but undeniably massive. I'm sure by now you've heard about Shein, its projects for an IPO, the allegations of forced labour, its revolutionary approach to fast fashion designs and social media promotion, and its getting unravelled in tensions between the US and China. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. For us on Explaining Brazil, we're not focusing on Shein, we're focusing on Shein, as Brazilians like to call it, and a whole host of other East Asian marketplaces, above all AliExpress and Shopee. We'll explain how these platforms got so popular in Brazil in the first place, and why they're causing a very particularly Brazilian political crisis, and why, while Shein may be a generational thing in the US and Europe, Shein is more of a class thing in Brazil. My name's Ewan Marshall, Deputy Editor of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil. If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. You can also go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, buying a coffee for one of our journalists, because God knows reporters live off of coffee. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Wild Rice, Jacira de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Andrei Novoseltsev, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vriesvik, Alistair Townsend, Milo Renacido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Joseo Z. Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more. The controversy surrounding East Asian marketplaces such as Shein, I'll go back to the original pronunciation now to avoid any confusion, is a discussion that involves some of Brazil's biggest political actors, including the House Speaker, Finance Minister, President Lula himself, and his wife. Above all, it concerns tax, and not just any tax, one that has been dubbed in Brazil the Taxa da Brusinha, or the Little Top Tax. We've covered the topic extensively on the Brazilian Report. Well, I say we. My fellow Deputy Editor Fabiane Ziola Menezes has covered the topic extensively on the Brazilian Report, and I'm delighted to have her back on the podcast today. Hi Fabiane.
Hi Ewan, great to be here again.
So there's quite a lot to get into in today's episode, so let's start with the basics. What is the little top tax that I was mentioning there?
So there are several, let's say, inconsistencies in the debate surrounding the topic. It's not that there wasn't import tax on small value orders before, and now there may be. What existed before was an import tax exemption for shipments between individuals. So if I lived in China and wanted to send you a package worth $50 or less, you wouldn't have to pay import tax on it because it would be a transaction between individuals. However, what started to happen and gain scale with the pandemic e-commerce digital boom is that sellers on these Asian marketplaces started to pose as individuals, sending packages to other individuals in Brazil so that their customers would not pay taxes. At the end of the day, they took advantage of a loophole in the Brazilian legislation, and also of failures in customs inspection, which before would only inspect small samples of these packages. And while the idea of this being little tops is emblematic, we are talking about products that go way beyond that, and that are sold 3-4 times cheaper than in domestic retail.
And Brazilian retailers are the biggest opponents to these East Asian marketplaces, right? What's their argument here?
Well, Brazilian retailers are complaining for some time now about unfair competition from these Asian platforms, AliExpress, Shein, Shopee, and others. And well, they are right. They say that not even restating the standard import tax of 60% on these purchases would make the situation fairer, as products sold by them here in Brazil pay an average tax burden of 109%. This, according to the estimates from IDV, which is a lobby for retailers. So, what they want is tax symmetry, and they are right.
So this was all going on unchecked for a while with complaints from local retailers, but then everything kind of came into the spotlight in 2023 as the government sought to get involved and take action. And this involved the president and the first lady, right? Remind us what happened there.
Yes, exactly. So early last year, what Finance Minister Fernando Haddad tried to do was reinforce customs inspection to catch these orders that were falsely being sent as individual to individual. But this move was read by consumers as the government seeking to tax their purchases from Shein, Shopee, and what have you. Uh, Consumers, including those in favor of the Lula government, decided to turn to the First Lady, Rosângela Lula da Silva, who's best known by her nickname, Janja, to complain about the idea, tagging her on social media and so on. And it worked. Not even, I think, 2 weeks after Haddad first touch on the topic, the pressure from the first family forced him to back away from the idea.
Right, so this feeds into something that I alluded to in the introduction. The ubiquity of Shein in Brazil is really something to behold. I mean, you can go to some of the remotest and poorest parts of the country, and when the post arrives, about half of it ends up being these orders from Shein. A measure like this in the US or Europe would probably upset some, people from Generation Z. But in Brazil, a measure like that could affect an election. These cross-border purchases have become so dear to a large part of the country's lower middle and working classes, regardless of their age. So, how did the government seek to negotiate its way around this problem then?
Well, what happened is that Haddad had to change his strategy. So in the middle of last year, months after the first, conflict with the first family, he said that he would increase inspection as planned, but that companies that join a new compliance program called Remessa Conforme and instruct their sellers to declare their orders correctly would be exempt from import tax on purchases up to $50. And this is the curious thing. Haddad practically created an import tax exemption on purchases of up to $50 between companies and individuals, which didn't exist before. All platforms, of course, joined the program, and Haddad ended up foregoing 32 billion reais in revenue until 2027. On the other hand, we now have an idea of how many little tops Brazilians are buying, because now more than 90% of all purchases are now passing through the customs inspection. And the figures are quite high, quite surprising. The volume of packages tripled between 2020 and 2023. So we are talking about 53 million packages in 2020, and now more than 210 million packages last year. So it increased a lot. Brazilians spend more than 6.4 billion reais on these parcels last year. So, I mean, there's a lot of little tops, right? The good news in terms of revenue end up going to the states. the government states, with the Federal Revenue Service controlling most of the parcels. The state governments were able to draw their line on the issue. They decided to tax the purchases with a 17% state goods and services tax, the ICMS, which was something that Finance Minister Haddad praised. He praised the governors for the measure, but exempted the federal government from following the same path. For him, Congress should be the one leading any sort of discussions on this. He also thinks that the compliance program was decisive to luring Shein to Brazil, and he might be right. The company already has over 300 Brazilian partner factories producing clothes for its marketplace and here in Brazil, and plans to begin shipping these products made in the country to other Latin American markets in 2026. Also, since the launch of Remessa Conforme, the compliance program, Shopee has also announced the expansion of its logistic operations. It opened 5 new distribution centers and now has 11 centers across the country.
And Fabiani, that wasn't the end of the import tax debate, of course, because we're back here talking about it. The latest discussion about these cross-border purchases involves electric cars and tortoises, and it's set to come to a head by the end of this week. Fabiani, explain to our listeners what the hell I'm on about.
Yes, I will try. Proposal to tax any international purchases, including the small value ones, was included in a provisional decree on electric cars. This type of move, of including something completely unrelated to a bill into a tax, is what we call here in Brazil a jabuti or tortoise. It's something normally done when legislators want to speed up the discussion around a certain topic and force its approval, as it's linked to this electric cars decree, which is an issue of high interest to the government. So that's the strategy right now, to force the vote, to force the discussion around the topic.
Yeah, so jabuti is essentially a rider clause that's kind of unrelated to the content of the original bill. That name, it comes from a popular Brazilian proverb that says that tortoises don't climb trees, meaning that if you find a tortoise in the tree, someone put it there.
Yes. And the provisional measure we are talking about, it expires on Friday. So it has to be voted on first, lawmakers and especially the House Speaker, Arthur Lira, they are using this deadline to force the discussion. But of course, things could go another way. Last week, when reacting to the House Speaker's decision to put the bill to a vote, President Lula said he could and probably would veto the legislation if it was approved. But he also noted that the government could negotiate the matter. It could be taken out from the provisional measure and discussed separately. Lawmakers are now talking about staggering the import tax on these purchases. That is, defining ranges of tax rates depending on the value of the order. But at the time we are recording this podcast, the situation is still up in the air. We don't know what will happen, What I think it would happen is that the House Speaker will likely agree to discuss the taxation of international purchases separately. But on the other hand, if the bill moves forward, it will likely be approved in the House because, retailers have got the lawmakers, support for it. The same should happen in the Senate. And then Congress would overturn any veto President Lula makes. And this might sound paradoxical, but I think Lula and Haddad would be okay with that, because for them, they just don't want, the government to be seen taking the lead on taxing the small value purchases.
And to round off this conversation then, Fabiani, why are Shein, AliExpress, Shopee so popular in Brazil? Why aren't people buying Brazilian? I mean, taking Shein as an example, there's constant criticism of the quality of these garments. So how can buying from China still be a better deal than buying something Brazilian?
Yeah, so as I said before, things are much, much cheaper in these Asian marketplaces. Last week, amid this debate, between government and lawmakers and everything, Shein disclosed a study by Ipsos that shows that 88% of its consumers here in Brazil earn less than 4 times the minimum wage, which speaks to Lula's argument that taxing these platforms would hurt poor consumers. And of course, his voters. We know that there are a series of problems when shopping on these marketplaces, such as counterfeit or low quality products. Still, the items are so much cheaper that it's worth trying. These platforms greatly improved logistical process. So although there are still complaints about products that did not arrive and so on, Brazilian consumers are much more satisfied with their services, and also they have something that the experts in the sector, the retail sector, call a split purchase model. That is, they found a way of splitting purchases into multiple orders so that they fall within any tax-free zone. And of course, they do that not only targeting Brazilian consumers, but all the markets where they operate. Sellers on AliExpress and Shopee, for example, they do the same thing with health and fitness equipment and electronics, for example, shipping them in parts and leaving it up to the consumer to assemble everything at home. Although strange, this static is not considered illegal, by companies or authorities. And they will likely continue to do this, even if Brazil decides to tax these orders in some way. This is something domestic players have not yet learned how to do, the split purchase model. So you can see how they have several advantages over their Brazilian counterparts at this point.
Fascinating stuff, Fabiani. Thanks so much for sharing your insight.
Thank you for having me again.
Just hours after we recorded this episode, the lower house of Brazil's Congress reached an agreement to approve a 20% tax on all international purchases worth less than $50. This was seen as a middle-of-the-road solution, a lot less than the 60% import tax charged on more expensive purchases, but a lot more than customers of Shein, AliExpress and Shopee and others were willing to pay. If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Or better yet, subscribe to The Brazilian Report, the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Our work has been recognised for its quality, and we've won several international awards. The Brazilian Report was named the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom by the World Association of News Publishers, WANIFRA, and more recently we won Best Story at the 2024 Digiday Media Awards for our scoop on the attempted hacking of one of Brazil's Supreme Court justices. To continue doing this work, we need your support, so go to Brazilian.report. I'm Ewan Marshall, thanks for listening. Explaining Brazil will be back next week.